And despite what they may think when they aren't in pain, people always prefer their own pain to be meaningless. They prefer only others' pain to be meaningful. They think they want machines that behave as though alive, but what they want are living beings that behave like machines. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching Leaf by Leaf as always. Today I have the pleasure of talking about Adam Levin, one of the contemporary novelists who has given me so much renewed hope and joy in the novel. Well, really in the story, in the literary arts, because he is not only a novelist. It should be pointed out that he is also a terrific short story writer. And in fact, in his second publication, a collection of stories called Hot Pink, you'll see that for Levin, the short story is not a sort of dress rehearsal for the big show, that being the novel, even though in our culture, we tend to treasure novels over poetry and short stories for some reason. It's kind of strange, actually, when you think about attention spans and stuff like that. It should be noted that Adam Levin is a product of the creative writing program in Syracuse. Yes, the same program where George Saunders teaches the course that he made available to the rest of us through this book, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. I reviewed this book last year, loved this book. There's so much to it. Just go watch the video because I don't want to take up too much time talking about it in Levin's video. But Levin was a student for this same program at Syracuse. And in fact, you'll see in the acknowledgments section, he'll thank fellow classmates and teachers. So if you know anything about George Saunders, if you know anything about that writing program in Syracuse, if you know anything about this book, then that should be enough for you to rush out and read everything that Levin has put out. I'd also like to point out right here at the start of the video that I used the French flap of the jacket of his second novel, Bubblegum, to mark that space for the excerpt I read at the very beginning. Well, as you'll learn in this highly imaginative world of Bubblegum, books actually do not like us to do this at all. You'll find that it causes them pain. So I'll put that back for you. Sorry about that. That's something you'd learn if your gate was open to receive messages from objects all around us. But before I go further into that, let's take a quick look at the books that I'm going to be talking about in this video. In his first novel, The Instructions, a precocious adolescent Jewish boy who believes he may well be the long-awaited Messiah decides to write his own scriptures, a sort of Third Testament or New Testament, or from his perspective, the correct New Testament. At the same time, he finds himself at odds with the world, kicked out of Hebrew school after Hebrew school, given to violent tendencies, outsmarting and stumping the scribes, rabbis, and Pharisees around him, trapped in a school program for gifted students tellingly called The Cage, navigating a rapidly growing host of disciples, whom he is preparing for an uprising reminiscent of his historical namesake, Judas Maccabee, and, perhaps most significantly, falling in love. The Instructions is one of those wild, exuberant first novels where the author gives no thought to playing it safe, yet remains fully in control of their craft. I can't say I've ever read a book that contains instructions for making a deadly weapon out of an empty pop bottle and a rubber band, and contains several passages of captivating, speculative midrashim, that is, Talmudic interpretation. The Instructions is about destiny, friendship, first love, justice, interpretation, and fate. In the end, the book challenges us in many ways similar to the challenge of the Torah or the Bible. It requires us to choose the lens through which we're going to view its content. Either the ideas and events in the book are nothing short of horrifying, or they are a testament to revolution and freedom. Yet, regardless of the chosen lens, there remains that Kierkegaardian leap of faith to complete the picture. His follow-up collection of short stories, Hot Pink, shows that clearly Adam Levin likes to read at least as much as he likes to write. He agrees that readers like to read interesting things, told in interesting ways. We want stuff that mirrors our world enough that we can relate, but that is distorted enough to ensnare our interest to the end. We want offbeat characters. We want bizarre situations. We want intense emotions, neurotic obsessions, and cataclysmic conflicts. And we want endings that leave us reeling. These are just a few of the promises on which Levin makes good in his short fiction. In his second novel, Bubblegum, the somewhat aimless with a broken past belt magnate lives in a world where his debut novel is relegated to the realm of long ago. His father is struggling through life ever since the passing of Belt's mother. His friends suspect that he's insane, likely schizophrenic, and his closest friend is a curio. A curio is a robotic animal that has captivated the world's consumerist population, i.e., everybody. They are lifelike pets that eat and sleep and play and excrete and replicate themselves and die. In a world where prostitution is legal and the internet doesn't exist, humans nonetheless discover a way to sate their inevitable drive for mindless, ephemeral pleasure that casts these curios in a completely new light. What was originally intended to help ameliorate psychological issues has spawned a big industry economy that capitalizes on, essentially, addiction. Not at all unlike our big pharma. But Levin lends another dimension to this alternate world. His imagination and behaviorist principles cue off of the concept of unbridled desire driving toward domination and power. Belt, however, like Gurion Maccabee before him, is at odds with his world. Levin makes perfect creative choices that allow Belt's horrifying revelation of the full range of his fellow humans' deplorable, yet culturally acceptable, behavior to be our own shocking revelation. In his most recent novel, Mount Chicago, Adam Levin presents a world in which a devastating natural disaster causes the earth to open up and swallow Millennium Park, the Chicago Art Institute, and nearby businesses. And, of course, almost everyone who happened to be in or around these sites. This leaves the mayor of Chicago to deal with the fallout. But luckily, he has the enigmatic Apter Schutz by his side to creatively and incisively turn the horror into hope, even if it means spending more money on and taking more time to build than the original Millennium Park. By a bizarre Dickensian coincidence, the comedian and novelist Solomon Gladman finds himself bereft of his family after the disaster. Only his smuggled from France Xanax and beloved Quaker parrot Gogol keep him tethered to life. But the Xanax is running out, and Gogol won't live forever. Meanwhile, the political shenanigans happening at City Hall are as highly entertaining as they are hilariously plausible. All the while, the pillars of behaviorism underpin this multi-layered and perspectively intertwined novel to show us how humans and animals alike spend their existence modifying one another's behavior in a symbiotic relationship, whether we realize it or not. The very first is this 1,000 pages of messianic mayhem or majesty, magic, mysticism, make-believe, martyrdom, masochism, matriculation. It all depends on how you view the book. It's either a revolution or a rebellion against tyranny, or it is delusional messianism that leads to something along the lines of terrorism. In any case, the book itself is a treasure. This is a postmodern novel that stays very close nonetheless to the modernist novel tradition in terms of guiding the reader along with the events, the narrative as they're unfolding, and our various characters. We are in the hands of someone who wishes to have us experience the splendor of all of these things as we go along. However, when it comes to the way in which it's written, the way that language is used to present this to us, it is fresh, it took me off guard many times, it delighted me over and over, and in fact, there's a character in here that mirrors a professor, a writing professor that Levin had at the University of Syracuse. He remarks about the deliciously Hebraic named protagonist, Gurion ben Judah Maccabee. It doesn't get better than that. This was put out by McSweeney's, so thank you so much, McSweeney's. Thank you, Dave Eggers. You also took a chance on William T. Vollmann's unexpurgated Rising Up and Rising Down, and then you published Levin's follow-up collection of stories called Hot Pink. And then Levin went to secure a publication with Doubleday for Bubblegum. I will say, however, that Bubblegum, was that ill timing. It came out sort of right at the genesis of COVID. So that kind of stinks. At the same time, I'm going to use this video to highlight the fact that I think Bubblegum is by far Levin's best work yet. That's not to say that the others aren't great. And now we have his most recent novel, Mount Chicago, also out from Doubleday. This is a wonderful, wonderful read. Although I do want to say that I feel like this is the first of maybe 3 or 4 acts. When it finished, I felt myself primed for the next book in this possible series. It seems that Levin did want to write something that was a much snappier read for us than Bubblegum, which is admittedly a much slower read than even the instructions. The instructions is actually blindingly fast-paced and just packed with fireworks display after fireworks display. It's like a 1,000-page novel that reads like a 200-page thriller, whereas Bubblegum is a 750-page novel that reads like Marcel Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu in its entirety. And then with Mount Chicago, we just are headlong in this thing, and everything, these worlds that Levin creates are so interesting, so fresh and refracted in a way that intrigues us about the implications for our own world as much as dazzles us with the robustness of such a wonderful imagination coupled together with the thrill of language. That is, Levin manages to marry these two qualities of a novelist, of a writer, the imagination unbounded with a joy of using language that comes through on the page. And even for people who aren't sensitive to it, it forces you to look at language as a work of art, as an artifice, as a painting on the wall of the Louvre. I would also like to mention that Levin's wife, Camille Bordas, has a novel out. It's called How to Behave in a Crowd. I haven't read it yet, but apparently Camille, who is born and raised in France, decided to write a story in English, and her very first story in English got published in the likes of the New Yorker, and now she wrote a novel in English, her second language. And I've heard that it's wonderful. I'll be getting to it and doing a video on it. Okay, let's start from the beginning of Levin's published work. I did not want to read through the hardcover again because of risked punishment, so I picked up a nice, cheap, used paperback and made that my reading copy. This is something that I often do with my books that I love and that I know I'll keep around. I'll have a hardcover to preserve it on the shelf as almost a commemoration of a reading experience. But then I'll have a paperback copy tucked in on the shelf behind it. The instructions is actually adapted or extremely expanded from his thesis that he delivered in the MFA program there in Syracuse. It was something like the first 200, 300 pages, or as the classic Levin narrator would say it, a couple 300 pages. And then it greatly expanded from there, and thankfully McSweeney's published it for us. So, he was a student of Saunders at Syracuse, but he also had a writing teacher whose last name is Flowers that shows up as a character in the whoops, I'm probably going to say the recognitions or the corrections or something like that a few times, but in the instructions, one of the things that Flowers points out about Gurion is that Gurion is a gifted describer. And this is one of the salient features of Levin's work. Adam Levin is a gifted describer. Even the most mundane things, he uses language that is so fresh or so precise that it triggers dopamine rushes in people who admire the use of language in novel ways. There's a sort of connection between the instructions and Don Quixote That being the fact that this book, as we learn in its opening pages, has been translated and retranslated. Gurion's indulgence of study and reading in the Talmud, in Zohar, in all of the different traditions of Jewish culture has almost gotten to his head and given him delusions, or let's say suspicions, of possibly being the Messiah, in sort of the way that Don Quixote has indulged or overindulged in his library of chivalric romances to the point where he sees himself as a knight errant. The whole ruse that makes Don Quixote such a joy to read is that displacement, that anachronism of dropping the knight errant in a modern day context. In the same way, we have this Messiah figure dropped into a contemporary context at a school there near Chicago. A couple of names come to mind even before they start to appear in print throughout Levin's works. One that will immediately come to mind when you start reading through the instructions will be Philip Roth. The next one is probably going to be J.D. Salinger. And in fact, Gurion can largely be seen as a 21st century Holden Caulfield. Gurion is given a voice, and this is written in the first person from the point of view of Gurion, but it's being delivered to us after scholars, and one scholar in particular, who is a character in here, has gotten their hands on it, added footnotes and things like that. But the voice that Gurion is given is addictive and constantly surprising. Like I said, the character Flowers in here notes this about Gurion's writing. And as Gurion is writing what he calls his scriptures, he's taking it to Flowers, and Flowers is giving him feedback. And one such piece of feedback that Flowers gives is this: forget the pathetic fallacy. There's what you write, and there's what you write about. Even if what you write about is boring, you can't be writing boring. Seemed to me like you want to write about Yu Wang anyhow. Now, Yu Wang, that's a good example because it's boring to me. Yu Wang is boring to most people. Half the world's got Wangs, and half all writers already written about them. Only thing ain't boring to me about your Wang is how you're calling it Wang. You're a creative little boy. Know some Yiddish slang like schwanz or schmuck or pizzle. Could call it anything you want, and you call it Wang. Wang outlandish. There is certainly a kinship here with David Foster Wallace and Infinite Jest. But don't go into the instructions thinking that this is the next Infinite Jest. There's only one Infinite Jest, and there's only one instructions. Levin will capture idiosyncrasies with phonetic spelling and use variations in those spellings of sometimes the same word to modulate the tone and mood of the character. Levin has a real gift for using even down to syntax in ways that I've never seen before, especially in Bubblegum. So as you're hearing, part of this book is about learning to write. It is a debut novel, and I've heard it said that the first novel is always about the author and is always about the author's quest for breaking out into a debut novel. Now, how opaque that is or not varies, of course, but here it's about medium-high opaque because, again, we are being given this book. It's being written and told in the first person. This is the same thing that'll happen in Bubblegum. It's given to us as a memoir that the protagonist is writing. Only with Mount Chicago will we start to see Levin operate in the third person. We've got stories within stories here, what has been called in Quixote and Boccaccio and people like that as interpolated tales. We've got footnotes. We've got wild digressions. But again, these things don't lead us off the path so much as they're almost leading us into hidden quarters of this museum of Levin's work. And so it's exciting, not dispiriting or bewildering or tiresome in any way. Like I said, the mechanics of language, the syntax, and rhetorical structures, and a highly sensitive ear for the idiosyncrasies and variations in different people's speech and body language. These are things that Levin clearly soaks up and stores away for his writing time when it comes back out, filtered through his novelist's sieve. "Josh Berman," said Jelly. "Josh Berman," said Jelly. "Not just a main hall shover," said Jelly. "And not just a Jewish shover," said Jelly. "But the alpha dog kind of Jewish shover," said Jelly. "How's that?" said Jelly. "What do you think of that?" said Jelly. This repeated "said Jelly" in this paragraph not only gives escalating rhetorical force, such as we find in different speeches, especially those of Martin Luther King, for example. But in this context, it provides the reader with these stops, with these sort of speed bumps, so that what Jelly is saying is delivered at the exact pace that Levin wants us to take it in. We get these one-off little lines from these characters like, "Isn't this the day's best part? You don't even have to remember to enjoy it. It enjoys you into itself." I read that over and over and over. What part of the day it is, that doesn't matter. You don't need that context. Just think about, we're sitting down to dinner and I say to you, this is the best part of the day. You don't even have to remember to enjoy dinner time. It enjoys you into itself. This is what I'm talking about when I say that Levin's work is fresh. Like I said, Roth comes up in here. Roth is a definite influence. I, myself, love Roth. I'm surprised I haven't done anything on the channel yet. It's actually been a few years since I read a Roth novel. I have enjoyed every single one of his books at varying degrees. One of my absolute favorites is The Dying Animal. And probably following that, or maybe about shoulder to shoulder, would be The Human Stain. There's this part where Gurion is addressing that separation, or at least that liminal space between the real life of the author of a work and that author's fiction. I was determined never to read those, talking about autobiographies. I didn't want to know what was true and what wasn't when it came to Roth, or any other writer of fiction I liked for that matter. But him especially. As long as the information I learned about him and what he believed did not come directly from him, I could ignore or embrace it at will, and it couldn't then interfere with the fictions he made, at least not that much, nor with what others made of those fictions, which was also important, sometimes at least. Of course, what we're getting at is the fact that Roth was a problematic figure in our culture. And we learn from the instructions that even for Jews, Philip Roth was very problematic. Some saw him as a total anti-Semite. Some saw him as a classic self-hating Jew. But then others, myself, it seems Levin included, don't see him as either of those things at all. This makes me think of William Gaddis, who has one of the greatest lines about wanting to sort of close himself off and hide from society, something that only Thomas Pynchon and Cormac McCarthy have seemed to do, so that there's almost a total separation between this man behind the curtain, or this figure behind the curtain, and the work out there on the stage. And he talks about how the author is the human shambles that follows the work around. Why do you want to know anything about the person, the writer? It's the work that matters. And I think, based on different things that we get from Levin's work, that he would agree with that. It's true that Philip Roth wasn't good for the Jews, but it bothered me that other Jews ever said so. It bothered me not only because he was as good for the Jews as any Jew of his generation could have hoped to have been, but because they, Roth's accusers, were also bad for the Jews, and for the most part, worse than Roth, who was always trying to protect them from themselves, which is what they believed themselves to be doing by accusing Roth of being bad for the Jews. I knew it wasn't really their fault, though. Not most of them, anyway. Nor his, for that matter. Jews couldn't help trying to protect themselves from themselves any more so than they could have helped being bad for the Jews. This is a lot of what made them Jews. And that is why it wasn't good to be Jews. And that is why I've been good for the Jews. Because I've been the end of the Jews. Except, of course, for the fictional Jews. Zuckerman and Glick, Stern and Kravitz and Gulk, Shylock, Gimple, Tevye and Flesch, each paley maid granny and sister and aunt, Kaczynski's boy and all his Ruthenians, Jews forever the lot. And Baruch Hashem, fiction needs Jews. All Israelites know this now, even Philip Roth, especially him. And we actually get a fictional Philip Roth who may have actually responded to Gurion or not. It may have been someone impersonating Philip Roth. So yes, this is a very Jewish book. It is highly provocative. Gurion is monstrously intriguing. He leads his cohort of people whom he wants to start referring to as Israelites instead of Jews on a revolt. And this has an ending that, for me, is a grade school gymnasium apocalypse that's more horrifying than the gymnasium shenanigans that ended Stephen King's Carrie. It will also be the instructions that sort of sets forth some different elements of the world that Levin will continue to develop for us. There will be references back to Gurion and the Israelites. There will be significant references to the date November 17th. But again, there are just these little moments, like when Gurion says, "The sky was always prettiest when I hadn't known I'd see it." There's a lot you could unpack there about expectation and extemporaneous excitations. Towards the end, we get this delicious satirical footnote about a profile piece that the New Yorker did on Gurion after the 1117 miracle, as it's referred to. And this is just Levin's imagination and insight into the literary world coming together to just please the reader. In the Pulitzer-winning profile of me in The New Yorker, with its blame the mother retro pop psychology, the ostensibly regretful yet subtly self-congratulatory critic at large. One, also in The New Yorker, by Malcolm Gladwell, who claimed I'd maliciously used my innate understanding of tipping points in order to ignite the current nationwide epidemic of radically defiant tween group behavior. The Person of the Year article in Time, with its sidebars on my mom, dad, Nakamuk, June, and Eliyahu, which said I was a vegan and fan of Ayn Rand. The interview with my former and would-be teachers on that episode of Nightline, where Kalish referred to me as a Jewish supremacist, Unger described me as an anti-Semite, and Schinkel either making fun of them or attempting to create a chord between them, or maybe even sincerely calling it as he post-colonially saw it. And I was the living dawn of the anti-Semitic Jewish supremacist movement. And the peerlessly demagogic feature in Harper's, which compared me in one windy, weirdly punctuated breath to Moshe Dayan, Benjamin Netanyahu, Osama bin Laden, Yasser Arafat, Jonathan Pollard, the Rosenbergs, Ari Fleischer, Ariel Sharon, and Shabbatai Zvi, then repeatedly used the word Zionist, the way Marxists and neocons use liberal, and ending by forming, accidentally or not, an acrostic of the word kike with the first letters of its last four sentences. I'm going to read just 3 paragraphs to give a sense of the fun use of language in this book. While upstairs, painkillered, my father slept deep. I prepared a forkless breakfast with my mom in the kitchen. On a breadboard on the counter, I smashed walnuts with a rolling pin. She, at the table, opened soft-boiled eggs. I liked eggs soft-boiled, but in the morning couldn't prep them, not if I wanted to put them in my stomach. Those insect-like screams emitted by the shell when you pried its fragments from that film they clung to. The mastication of wet chicken sounded musical by comparison. Walnuts in pieces, I dumped the sip of cloudy topwater from a tub of Greek yogurt. I globbed honey from a jar across the yogurt's flat surface. I folded and stirred till the color was even, then folded some more till my mom's task was finished. When she signaled it was, I came to the table, the tub in one hand, breadboard in the other. We liked to add the walnuts as we went. The yogurt of our forkless breakfasts was for the most part treated like dessert. Though we'd always cool our mouths before we ate our eggs, we'd only use a spoonful, never even two. While the roof blisters you'd get from a scalding one stung, nothing eggy was as nasty as a gluey, tepid yolk. Plus, our egg cups, glass, were shaped like half an ostrich, and the closer the temperature of what you drew from them matched yours, the less cute the images your brain coughed up. Half-formed wings and beaks of high plasticity, goo that would be claws and bone, a pulsing spaghetti of veins and tendons, ligaments and cartilage not yet chewy, throbbing, webbed, red membranes. So you hear also a lot of that consonance that's going on. You can tell that Adam Levin likely reads a lot of his stuff out loud and gets the pleasantries for the sonic quality of language down before considering it final. Of course, with a book this size and with everything that is put into it, it's hard to do it justice without a whole series of videos. Suffice it to say, however, that this is worthy of its size. It is worthy of your time. Again, it's a blazingly fast read for such a chunker of a book. And it's also one of those books where it amazes you how one person can know so much. Jewish hijinks in literature have been done over and over again, but somehow Levin comes through and sort of reinvents it for the start of the 21st century. Next up is his short story collection, Hot Pink. A lot of these stories, as he tells us in the acknowledgement section, many of these stories in here were begun, and a couple or three of them finished, while I attended the Syracuse University MFA program in creative writing. So again, just like the instructions coming out of his sort of capstone or his thesis in that program, here we have a lot of stories that he worked on. I know that it's kind of maybe hypocritical or paradoxical or maybe contradictory, maybe ironic, but I'm not going to linger over the stories, even though I said that they are anything but a dress rehearsal for the novels. I just want to point a few things out. Again, I'm trying to get to Bubblegum and Mount Chicago to highlight his most recent work. Every single one of these stories has everything you want in a work of fiction. There are interesting ideas presented in ways that hook you, and you cannot leave the story until you've read every word. There are characters that we recognize, but then they not so much exceed our expectations as nullify our expectations and recreate them in their image on their terms. In the second story, I believe this is the second story. First of all, the first story title is Franken-Wittgenstein. How great is that? But the second one is Considering the Bittersweet End of Susan Falls, and this one will actually get retreading in Mount Chicago. I found this one to be one of the best in the whole collection. And there's a sentence in here in the third paragraph on the first page that is exemplary of reading Adam Levin. It says, "She lost her legs as a baby, comma, in the jungle, comma, to gangrene, comma, after the leopard bit her." So this sort of prepositional parataxis, as I'm calling it, slows down the pace, kind of like those said jelly, said jelly, said jelly interpolations, so that each phrase in this studded series gives the reader a new surprise. She had lost her legs as a baby. Already it's horrible. In the jungle. In the jungle? What? Why was she in the jungle? To gangrene. Oh, now it's even worse. How did she get the gangrene? What was she doing there? And then the coup de grace, after the leopard bit her. And as this story unfolds and we start to sense from the dynamic between the mother and Susan Falls, and we start to have that revelation of what really happened, really makes for a chilling conclusion. But in the midst of that, Levin shows that more than just a pyromaniac who can put on these crazy, grand 4th of July fireworks finales, he also knows how to give us pinpricks of human emotion. And towards the end of the story, we'll get this thought. How could you mourn the end of something you never had a chance to take for granted? Now, as if that formulation weren't already so perfectly well wrought to seize our attention and to make us linger on that for a moment before moving on to the next paragraph, it ends with a period, not a question mark. Here's another wonderful moment, and just great writing. In the title story, Hot Pink, we get this. A couple blocks away from the Christamestas, this full-grown man walking the other way on the other side of the street looked at us and nodded. It's a small thing to do, but it means a lot. It meant we were feared. My lungs tickled at the sight of it. I got this tightness down the center of my body, like during a core strength workout, or trying to first kiss someone and you can't remember where to put your hands. This is one of a slew of pieces of figurative language that cannot fail to delight. And in case I haven't at least intimated this yet, reading Levin is just plain fun. 415 was raging. 50, 40 people, mostly middle-aged guys wearing Oxfords and sandals. Some of them had wives, but there weren't any babies, which always spooks me a little. A barbecue without babies. Like if you ever had a father who shaved off his mustache. It reminds me of David Foster Wallace, I think in Infinite Jest, when he said, there's something really creepy about an old guy who's in great shape. And now on to Bubblegum, his second novel. Bubblegum is a rare treat, especially in our current culture when there are long-form entertainments now that are done very, very, very well. These would be fantasy novels in the literary space, but more in the cinematic space, I'm talking about the TV series. And there has been a part of me here and there that's grappled with the assertion or the provocation that the TV series is slowly but surely replacing the novel. But of course, I think about what Toni Morrison said in her interview on Bookworm back when the movie Beloved was made. And Michael Silverblatt and Toni Morrison talked about the differences between literature and film. And Morrison said that no, the visual art, though good and in its own right, very important and artistic, it can't replace the silent act of sitting with a book. Toni Morrison calls this the private or secret space of literature that needs a reader. Bubblegum, which again had the fate of coming out alongside COVID's release. Bubblegum is a novel that allows me to stand my ground and know beyond any doubt that the TV series cannot replace a novel like Bubblegum. Bubblegum represents Adam Levin operating at the full capacities of his powers as a writer in every single category. Sentences, syntax, imagination, creativity. Levin's knowledge of behaviorism, of B.F. Skinner, both through reading and research and also hands-on as a social worker, are brought in here. There's also a hint at this in one of the short stories in Hot Pink. The character is ridiculed because of being a proponent of behaviorism. Most people only know the horrible things about Skinner or have seen A Clockwork Orange. But behaviorism is all through Levin's work, and it will come out again in an even more overt fashion and closer to Levin's own life experience in Mount Chicago. Mount Chicago also takes time to really explain some of the thinking, and there's a professor character through whom we learn a lot more about behaviorism than its opponents would have us believe. And behaviorism is also a great lens through which to look at the work of Levin, because especially when he brings in characters who aren't human, be it a Quaker parrot named Gogol, or in this case, a cure. But he shows so well how the behavior of the human world is such that we are always constantly modifying and being modified by context and other people. My cat Socks has learned to modify my behavior so that he gets what he wants, and I have learned how to cause him to modify his behavior so that I get what I want. This is one of the core tenets of behaviorism. So let me do my best now to explain why I love Bubblegum. A great novelist will disrupt the perfunctory order of language to expose something new to us about the world we live in. This kicks off right away as the character modifies language to assert his presence, to seize attention. Growing up, I'd heard, "Shut your pie hole, cake face," a couple or 3 times a week from my father. The pie hole that's shutting, he'd demand, was rarely mine though. Right away, second sentence of the whole novel, that's, T-H-A-T-S, no apostrophe. I've never seen this before that I can recall. But immediately, after I read the sentence a few times, I realized that he's using it sort of like it's when it's I-T-S, no apostrophe, meaning that it's possessive. The pie hole that's shutting. And it wouldn't be until about 750 pages later that the main character, Belt Magnet, who is writing this memoir for us in the first person, will then pick up and call our attention to that second sentence of the whole book. And there, right there in the second line of the book, this book we're reading, Bubblegum, my great lasting contribution to English as it's written. What I imagined would be my great lasting contribution, one of my great and lasting contributions, that seemingly humble yet revolutionary innovation that is the word that's, no apostrophe. Over the last couple months, I'd completely forgotten about my thatses. How could I have forgotten? That's was a word that every speaker of English made use of. Whenever it came time to attribute the possession of something to non-living things, or even, for that matter, non-human animals, whose had always sounded wrong. Whose had never sounded right to anyone. And formulations involving of which were often too clumsy, inefficient, even a little, or a lot, pretentious sounding. That's the reason why people said that's. So why had no one before me thought to write it down? Because of the word that's, with an apostrophe? Maybe. Yet there was it's, with apostrophe, and there was also it's, without apostrophe. That's was no reason to forego that's, nor was that ever pluralized into that's. That became those. So there was no reason not to formally recognize that's as a word. No reason whatsoever not to teach that's in school. No good reason, anyway. And yet, how could it be? How could it be that after so many years of so many millions of people speaking English, I, Belt Magnet, 1975 through, still alive, so no death date, would be the one to provide the OED with its first citation for that's? I couldn't see how it could be, yet it was. Perhaps I was missing something. Maybe I was crazy. I typed up alternates of this memoir's second sentence to try to get a better sense of whether I was crazy. The pie hole whose shutting he'd demand was rarely mine, though. The pie hole, the shutting of which he'd demand, was rarely mine. However, of the pie holes he'd demand be shut, mine was rarely one. I was not crazy. That's, no apostrophe, was superior. That's was a winner. I would be in the canon. All I had to do was finish writing the memoir. This little passage not only calls our attention back to that novel use of the word in the second sentence of the book, but it also shows that Levin is operating on a level where he takes language so seriously and wants to push its limits so vigorously that the passion for writing, even at that level, comes through in that little digression. So from that small example, one thing that Levin does so well is that he comes in and disrupts language for us in such a way to make the novel without alienating anyone. That's really a balancing act that takes real talent to pull off. The use of that's without the contraction is not the only innovation Levin employs in Bubblegum. He also sets off the dialogue of the inanimate objects that are able to communicate with Belt through his open gate in pipes. That is, that straight bar character. And so instead of double quotes on either side of dialogue like we're used to seeing, with human beings speaking, we get these pipes, which I think is brilliant, not only because it's a piece of syntax we've not really seen before in literature, in novels, but also because it does give the sense of this being special dialogue that is mostly closed off. These straight pipes also make me think of the pathways in gate logic, in like a circuit diagram that can be opened and closed by different logical gates. Logic is actually something that underpins a lot of Levin's work. Bubblegum is set in an alternate world. In this world, there is legal prostitution, there is no internet, and there are these bottomals, these robotic animals that people keep as pets. But people find these very outrageous and pernicious uses of them. What ends up happening with these little robot pets that are supposed to be these cute little companions for people is that they actually bring out the worst within us. But what Levin does so well with this book is that he thrusts the reader so far and so deeply into this world without fully explaining what's going on, just showing us these bizarre things and using this slang, dacting, autodact, overloading. We're not fully comprehending what's going on in this world, but there's just enough for the mystery to grow and grow and grow. And then most of what's going on becomes clear in the absolutely brilliant portfolio section of this novel. I cannot stress enough how brilliant this is. This is a structural choice that Levin made such that even though the ruse here is that we're reading a memoir that Belt Magnet is putting together, Belt, in the course of events, gets contracted to transcribe a DVD compilation that another character has put together, and that becomes presented to us in the portfolio section. So this something like an hour and a half, 2 hour long compilation of videos that Belt is watching, we are watching it in a sense by reading his transcription of it. But it's absolutely brilliant because it finally takes all of these different little barbs that have stuck into us and it sort of rips our flesh open and exposes the reality of what's going on beneath the surface. It's also so useful in developing this world. You could almost refer to Bubblegum as world building. The information that's imparted to us that builds atop that foundation that has been laid for us creates a totally vivid world. What Levin is doing is he's using a sort of cross-section or intersection of behavioralism and astoundingly imaginative new ways that humans succumb to addiction. The book seems to me to whisper truths about human nature that I would rather stay deaf to. There are things that happen in this book that continue to haunt my quietest moments. In fact, I'm not sure I've been this disturbed and this delighted by a piece of literature in a long time. Basically, what I'm saying is that where this book succeeds so well is that the things that are given to us and make us feel the sense of the uncanny, the sense of the strange, those stranger things, once we're in so deep into this world, suddenly this portfolio section, it's almost like it goes and activates those stranger things and they become little sticks of dynamite that explode with the implications of what's really going on in this world. Again, there are ties back to the world that Levin began with the instructions. There are more funny little pieces of satire that pull in, like an interview with Michel Houellebecq. There's little loving allusions to New Directions and Dulce Archive. Again, there's the striking figurative language, such as this. This is referring to a parrot, and its hooked black beak looked like something a ninja might strap to a thumb on his way to a regicide. How did he come up with that? Again, we get glimpses of the way that a true writer's mind works. By the time I'd chewed it soft enough to blow a good bubble, there wasn't any sweetness left in the gum. Probably that was metaphorical for something. I didn't know what, or how to figure that out. When he does refer back to the instructions, it's in this way. They think we're called the Yachts, and they think I'm their leader. They read some stupid novel. New kid at school bands the losers together, starts an uprising. We get a loving reference to Seminary Co-op as Belt Magnet's definite favorite bookstore. One of the interesting things about Belt Magnet is that he appears to have an open gate of communication where inanimate objects or seemingly inanimate objects can talk with him, be that swing sets or a pillowcase or even a book. He wonders for a while if books can actually communicate with him. And if they can, he's dying to know if they understand what's written on them, what's written within them. Can he have a conversation with a book where the book knows its material better than the writer who put it there and better than the reader who extracts it back out? This is a very interesting thought that implies a lot of different discussion from literary theory. A book will eventually talk to him, and the answer that the book provides when Belt implores the book to answer his question is profound. In the midst of everything that's going on, the death that we maybe fear the most happens. And when it happens, this is how it's delivered. This isn't a spoiler. I shrugged as hard as I could, and it was over. So again, the death we feared the most, the one that, at least for me, was the most emotional, comes with body language that means, I don't know. This is one of the best novels I have ever read. It requires patience and attention, but its rewards are infinite. Hopefully this will get the attention it deserves, even though the cover isn't scented like bubblegum, which is something the publisher, Doubleday, apparently wanted to do. I found that out because Adam Levin is a character in his latest novel, Mount Chicago. Or as he presents himself, he just is Adam Levin, who's writing this novel. We all know that, so why not just come out and say it? He is the narrator, so technically this is narrated in the first person. Or I should say, it's given to us from Adam Levin, who steps in every now and then. It's narrated in the third person. We don't take the point of view of the characters in the story in which we're getting. It's a love letter to Chicago. It's extremely literary. It's got all the qualities that I've listed out for you so far. Somehow he's still figuring out how to make language fresh and to come up with more striking imagery. Again, it's part of the Levin cosmos. So it's got pointers, reference points to the other work, and it's just plain fun. There's even this fable that's modeled on the story of the Exodus. But Levin also brings us a novel that is clearly contemporary. Political correctness, pronoun politics, cancel culture, Wikipedia, Urban Dictionary, anxiety, depression, and suicide, text messaging, cryptocurrency, autocorrect, FaceTime, audio editing. This is a mirror of our time right now, raised in its literariness into something that's universal. Like I said, it's partly a love letter to Chicago. Adam Levin is a longtime Chicagoan. He now lives in Florida. We get all these glimpses of Chicago and Chicago places, Chicago staples. And the main event that this novel is situated around is the anomaly, as they call it, that happens on November 17th, the same day that the miracle happens in the instructions. Millennium Park, Cloudgate, and the Art Institute all pretty much fall into a chasm that opens up in the ground. And out of that chasm rises this huge cone or sphere that's referred to as Mount Chicago. But in the course of the narrative, we get this. Cloudgate, a stainless steel sculpture by Anish Kapoor that was so finely polished and so smoothly curved it appeared to be a daub of liquid mercury. A 70-foot long, 3-story high, 30-foot deep daub of fat liquid mercury, shaped like a bean, laid hollow side down. Its reflective surface funhouse bending everything surrounding it, clouds and skyline and plaza and avenue, and funhouse bending you below it, if you went below it, which is what you did. It's what everyone did, adult and child and adolescent alike. When they visited Cloudgate, they went underneath it, stood directly beneath its concavity's apex, looked up into their funhouse bent reflections, and, more often than not, snapped a photo or two of what they saw there. And that's exactly what I did the first time I visited Cloudgate. Solomon Gladman, who is a stand-up comedian, a sort of impromptu stand-up comedian who has also written some successful novels. He has a Quaker parrot named Gogol, and it says that he renamed it after the author of The Overcoat, his favorite short story. He hoped that his parrot would behave like the work of Nikolai Gogol. He hoped his parrot would be funny and tender and spirited and weird and no more anti-Semitic than its milieu. We get these great little literary allusions, such as the thought of a post-punk band named Evening Redness in the West. In another moment, it says that a screaming came across the sky, and that screaming happens to be screeching from Gogol. Again, we get these great sentences where each piece of it starts to surprise us a little more with this little crescendo of an ending. When next he came awake, it was dark outside. His stomach was rumbling, and his life had become a meaningless tragedy. And this is because almost everyone Gladman knows and loves is killed in the anomaly. This isn't something that is a spoiler. It's given to us right away. And so the course of events are centered all around that tragedy. And we see two main characters here. We get Solomon Gladman, the widower, and then Abner Schutz, who is this sort of wunderkind character who gets into all these endeavors. He's kind of like a non-messianic Gurian character. Totally precocious and works his way up to where he's suddenly the mayor of Chicago's right-hand man. He helps the mayor conceive this project to build back a memorial park on the, ground zero of what is now called Mount Chicago, where the anomaly happened. And one of the things that Abner decides he wants is Solomon Gladman to make an appearance and give a performance, because Gladman is his and many other characters' favorite comedian. After the tragedy, we get this extended exposition or backstory about Gogol from a time in the past. And this extended exposition ends set off in its own paragraph with this. And that was why Gladman, since 1117, despite possessing the means and desire to kill himself painlessly, had continually decided not to do so. That was the one and only reason. That reason being, he is Gogol's caregiver. And as long as Gogol's alive, he has to stay alive to take care of him. Otherwise, there's nothing to live for. I thought to myself, what a great way to convey Gladman's grief, to redirect to an earlier story and use that to lead into the grief by comparison of the love for Gogol being the only thing that's keeping him alive at this point. Otherwise, the novelist is faced with rehashing one of 1,000 ways that grief has been described in literature before. He does this again just a little bit later. He uses Gogol's point of view to convey Gladman's grief. After that first time, Gladman never did the new laugh in the same room as Gogol. So Gogol is giving us a sense of how he experiences this new laugh of Gladman's after the tragedy. Of course, the parrot doesn't know about the tragedy. It says sometimes he'd start to do the new laugh, 2 or 3 soft, choky sounds. But before Gogol would even realize that Gladman was doing the new laugh, Gladman would leave the room. Or, if they were in a room that wasn't the kitchen, he'd take Gogol to the kitchen and put him on his cage and go to the bedroom or go to the office and close the door. This is such a great way to show us through the eyes and ears of the parrot, because we know that what's really going on is this isn't a new laugh. This is a sort of hysterical grief. Now that I think about it, this sort of redirection away from showing us directly Gladman's grief and instead focusing on Gogol's point of view for an extended period of time. This operates much like the way that the Brilliant Portfolio section operates in Bubblegum. We redirect away from the narration of events and we instead get that transcription and we're shown things obliquely. And this somehow raises the emotional impact up several pitches. Levin proves that he is still as meticulous and hyper-conscientious of language and syntax as ever. When a character is viewing a post on Facebook or some social media, it says 8-time suicide survivor. What starts to be debated in one of the innumerable Levinian digressions is the possible oxymoron of suicide survivor. That's totally contradictory. But because the post says that it's an 8-time suicide survivor, instead of calling it an oxymoron, it is given to us as octomoron. Bravo, Levin. And like I said, we get a deeper glimpse into behaviorism. I began to study behaviorism, this is after Schutz, which can't help but cause anyone who studies it to face the fact that whether we're aware of it or not, we are all shaping one another's behavior all the time. We couldn't stop if we tried, and so we are all shaped by one another's behavior all the time. And that, in fact, is the best lens through which to read this book. Take note of how animals and humans alike are constantly shaping each other's behavior. There's a desire that each character seeks, and they'll shape behavior knowingly or unknowingly, that is, consciously or subconsciously, but it's happening. But all of that to say that behaviorism does not deny the existence of interiority. This is getting at a lot of detractors of behaviorism have talked about how, you're denying the fact that there's a mind, there's an interior figure. What behaviorism denies is that interiority can be examined empirically. It denies the possibility of a science of interiority. Behaviorism leaves interiority alone. It concerns itself with the interaction between observable behavior and context, because anything one did or said, i.e., all of one's behavior, was, according to behaviorism, done or said or knowingly. By the way, that's something, I'll put it on the screen here, but the or knowingly, meaning unknowingly or knowingly, it's just another glimpse at Levin being creative and really economic with his use of language in order to manipulate one's environment and the people within it, i.e., in order to manipulate one's context. Any client suffering could be reduced to a description of A, the failure of the client's manipulations to manipulate the environment and others in ways the client predicted/desired, and/or B, the client's failure to be manipulated by the environment and/or others in ways that the client and/or others predicted/desired. That was it. That was everything. There's a chapter almost smack in the middle of the book that's labeled Face Problem. And this is where Adam Levin steps in and speaks directly to us. And it's so candid that it's almost like he shows up wherever you're reading the book just to kind of check in with you and tell you a couple of things. And we learn about real life stuff that was happening in and around his writing. We find that Bubblegum was rejected by 27 publishers and continued to get rejected 15 more times over the course of 6 months. That just shows, again, it doesn't mean that every novel that gets rejected by a bunch of publishers is actually a work of genius. But in this case, it does follow on the heels. I just got done reading a bunch of Beckett's work and put out a long video on it. And this is the same thing that happened to Beckett. He was continually rejected. And it's because these authors are seeing things that are so far ahead of the culture, so far ahead of the critics, that we don't even have the right rubrics to detect that this is a work of genius. But this little section, Face Problem, captures so many things that just make Levin and his work such a treasure to all of us. And it is also another one of these attempts, of which there's a long history through literature, where the author is acknowledging with us that, hey, listen, this is artifice. You and I are communicating through artifice. But it's nonetheless important because on either side of this sculpture that is Mount Chicago, the anomaly and the book, there are living humans trying to make it in this world. The one human trying to get this writing done and get through all the revisions and hope that it gets published. And then the reader trying to find time in the onslaught of life to glean from its pages. But what's so amazing is that this doesn't diminish the work in any way. for me, this actually augments the enjoyment. In contrast to Bubblegum, this is, again, like the instructions, a lightning fast read. You can, just the way it's written is you just kind of are pulled along by this story. The characters are so interesting. The way that it's presented is so interesting. The anomaly is so interesting. And the politics with the Chicago mayor and his right-hand man after Shuts, the way that they're going to spin this thing for the city of Chicago is so interesting and such great parody that you're just having a great time reading. But I have to say that I'm hopeful this is just the first of several acts. It felt like the curtain only closed on Act 1 here. I'm left wanting so much more because Levin has set up these situations. Yes, it is a faster read and could perhaps reach more people, but at the expense of what we get in a book like Bubblegum. I guess what I'm saying is that I hope this brevity isn't because of some kind of editorial or marketability constraint. This would be tantamount, in my opinion, to going to a 1990 Chicago Bulls game and only seeing Michael Jordan perform for the first half of the game. It's still Michael Jordan, but it was only half of the performance. So I'd like to say thank you to the MFA program there at the University of Syracuse. Thank you to McSweeney's. Thank you to Doubleday. But above all, thank you, Adam Levin, for giving us rich literature that does not compromise. And I can't wait for the next book in the Mount Chicago series.